Namaskar, friends. We have been talking about various aspects of modern age, especially modern poetry. So far, I have been talking about a brief historical background and the kind of technical experiments or innovations without which the very concept of modern poetry is impossible. I also talked about T.S. Eliot as a poet, and today in this video, I shall be giving a small, precise introduction to his magnum opus, The Waste Land. The Waste Land was published in the year 1922 in the magazine The Criterion in London. And in the same year, it got published in the Dial in New York, US. There are different approaches to look at the poem, but the basic approach and the most important approach is that the poem gives an eye-opening account of the barrenness, of the vast panorama of futility and anarchy, of spiritual chaos, of several layers and levels of disintegrations in terms of moral, ethical, religious, and it gives the kind of the state of value which is degraded in the European society that primarily arose due to several kinds of scientific achievements which led to the emergence of industries and industrializations, and the side effects of this process, which how cities were made, rural societies were broken, received a great amount of dent, and there was a kind of huge dent in the very fabric of communal life, family life, in terms of joint families. So I'm leaving that discourse behind for you to think over that critically. At this juncture, it is also necessary for us to know the impact of World War First. How World War First brought a huge amount of rupture, a huge amount of demolition, a huge amount of destruction that involved all the major so-called developed countries of Europe, and the whole Europe turned out to be graveyard. The wasteland, as I was talking in terms of spiritual chaos, fertility, no. It's all about futility. And this futility and spiritual loss is almost accompanied by the kind of importance, the kind of significance which was allotted to sex. How sexual relationship, which once upon a time was supposed to be a sacred affair. Remember prothalamion, epithalamion, whereby sex was allotted only within the boundaries of marriage. Even one can recall John Donne when in his poem The Canonization he talks about the exalted state of sexual relationships leading to the status of sainthood. Don't think of that in 20th century. Look at this opening stanza, opening lines of the poem Selling to Byzantium by W.B. Yeats. And this opening statement is more than enough to give you enough picture, to give you a clear sight image, state of living which Eliot has been talking about in his magnum opus, The Wasteland. That is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song. Dying generations at their song. Think about John Keats and his Nightingale poem. The salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh or fowl, commend all summer long. Whatever is begotten, born and dies, caught in that sensual music, all neglect, monuments of unaging intellect. So instead of spiritual celebration, there is sexual celebration. Instead of spiritual music, there is sensual music. And people have forgotten the importance of unaging intellect, soul and oversoul. The poem, The Wasteland, talks about the spiritual wasteland and the isolation of man from God. Just remember what Nietzsche said in terms of his famous declaration of the death of the God, or the theories put by Charles Darwin in his book Origin of Species. It's a godless world. It's a world of machines. It's a world of robo. There is no instinct left, no emotion left. And people are bound to live a life in death and death in life. Remember St. Coleridge's poem, The Rime of Ancient Mariner. This spiritual chaos, this futility has been the integral part of human societies. I'm saying societies. And these societies in that way not only belong to the 20th century, But there have been several instances, several examples of this kind of society or these kinds of societies. And when T.S. Eliot, in his essay Tradition and Individual Talent, he talks about the pastness of the past, that is, one should have the thorough knowledge of one's cultural richness, cultural heritage. One should have the consciousness of one's past. Past is never dead. Past is always there in one's mind. And there should be that consciousness, that historical consciousness. And that historical consciousness should be, as Eliot says, not only the pastness of the past, but of its presence too. So how past and present, they all become together. They all become one. So it's temporal and timeless in the sense that whatever is happening in one's own contemporary society, that is not exclusive. The same must have happened once upon a time when you open the book of history. So this is temporal and timeless in that context. Eliot, in his mammoth task to understand the present reality which I was talking in terms of industrialization and the post World War I first, and he uses his vast historical consciousness. He takes a deep plunge into the history. In a way, he establishes a kind of parallel between the past and the present. And this is done by a method which is called Mythical Method. The Mythical Method that arose in the light of vast studies carried out in the fields of myth and anthropology. We have different writers and anthropologists who have been working immensely in this area. As far as literature is concerned, T.S. Eliot offers his gratitude to James Joyce, because James Joyce happens to be the first man in 20th century. He uses that mythical method in his novel Ulysses in an elaborate and expanded manner. But when it comes in the hands of Eliot, he uses the same but with a difference. And the difference lies in the technique of compression and telescoping with poetic shorthand, and the way he links the modern contemporary predicament with other histories of the past. In this technique, past and present are not remote entities, but are interrelated, they merge together to make a deep, insightful commentary on modern crisis and disillusionment. It has been used by different writers, as I told James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, and if you read W.H. Auden, you can find the same, especially in his poem, The Shield of Achilles. In the last of 19th and the beginning of 20th century, there have been serious studies in the field of myth and anthropology. So we have Miss Jessie Weston and her book From Ritual to Romance, which was published in the year 1922. And in this book, Miss Jessie Weston talks about famous myth of the Holy Grail, as well as she talks about the biblical wasteland which took place in the regime of Fisher King. In the simplest form, the myth of Fisher King or Holy Grail relates to the impotent king, and due to this impotency, there has been a kind of drought, starvation. The kingdom was cursed, the king was cursed. The curse was believed to be lifted by a pure-hearted stranger who would visit the kingdom and answer certain ritual questions. In the course of time, this legend was blended with the story of the Holy Grail. The Grail was the cup of plate used by Christ at the Last Supper, in which Joseph caught the blood from the wound in Christ's side at the time of crucifixion. It was soon discovered that the vessel had acquired medicinal and miraculous properties, and steps were at once taken to build temples for organizing the worship of the holy vessel. But a time came when this holy relic of Christianity disappeared mysteriously, and the search for the Grail eventually became an allegory for man's quest for truth or spiritual realization. The great Victorian writer Alfred Lord Tennyson adopted this Grail story for his Idylls of the King, where he makes Sir Galahad the immediate knight of King Arthur's Round Table and the leader to pursue the Holy Grail. So there are several stories. So the basic line is the Holy Grail happens to be in a chapel perilous. Nobody can reach there but somebody who is sexually pure, and in spite of the purity, he has to undergo several trials and tribulations, has to answer questions, then only he could be in a position to take hold the Holy Grail. This must be followed by the ritual of the washing of the maimed king's feet before the advent of the blessed rain, announcing the return of fertility to the king and to his dry kingdom. Miss Jessie Weston's book, From Ritual to Romance. We have another important book, James George Fraser's The Golden Bough, A Study in Magic and Religion, and it was published in 12 volumes over a period of time from 1819 to 1936. And this book is an encyclopedic study of the primitive life, an extensive study of myths and rituals. A work, according to T.S. Eliot, a work which has profoundly influenced his generation. In this book, Fraser primarily deals with the theme of recurrence. Recurrence in terms of cyclical process of life. Remember, I was talking about a new concept of history as given by Vico. And this recurrence, this cyclical process, this circular nature is not simply restricted to folk, indigenous, primitive rites and rituals. It is equally present in the so-called high culture like Christianity. One can think about Christ, his crucifixion, and then his rebirth and all other things. This book talks about the continuum of birth, death, and rebirth. And this important seminal book talks about fertility myths, which are prevalent in almost every primitive civilization, the stories of dying gods, and their reappearance and rebirth, which is woven around, circular in nature and woven around a kind of cyclical process, a kind of recurrence. Structure. The poem is a symphony of 5 interconnected movements dealing with various aspects of modern life and connecting that to larger historical backdrop. T.S. Eliot, in one of his essays, The Music of Poetry, beautifully sums up the structure. And there he writes, the use of recurrent theme is as natural to poetry as to music. There are possibilities for verse which bear some analogy to the development of a theme by different groups of instruments. There are possibilities of transition in a poem comparable to the different movements of a symphony or quartet. There are possibilities of contrapuntal arrangement of subject matter. So it beautifully sums up and clears that this poem is created out of different divergent statements, different divergent fields, different in terms of differences, and they all have been clubbed together into a poem, The West Land. As I told, the poem has 5 movements. So the first movement is the burial of the dead, and the immortal lines, April is the cruelest month. So the second movement is a game of chess, where the poet talks about different kinds of stories through a game of chess, the kind of manipulative attitude, the kind of plottings, the kind of conspiracies, where all the energy is channelized to seduce, to rape, and to get into the kind of sexual abyss. The fire sermon, here we have from the eastern India, not eastern India, we have from eastern countries. India is one of those countries, east. So we have Buddhism, Lord Buddha and his fourfold theories, fourfold preaching, whereby he talks about fire in terms of desire, kamana. And we have in West St. Augustine and his Confessions, where he talks about desire. And it would be quite interesting to see these East-West encounter and the way they have been juxtaposed in the poem, The Wasteland, and in the movement, The Fire Sermon. Death by water simply takes us back to the kind of affiliations, associations which we have been associating with water, and it also relates itself to the James George Fraser's book, The Golden Bough, and what the thunder said, the famous movement which talks about Prajapati and his da 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 datta damyatandayadhvam, which shall be talked about in details once we begin with the poem, The West Land. Tiresias. Tiresias is the protagonist of this poem. We have been seeing Tiresias in Sophocles, in Euripides, in Pindar, and in Ovid. In Greek mythology, he is a Theban seer, a very powerful man. There are several stories regarding his existence, but the most important and universally accepted one is that once he saw snakes mating, and it is said that one should not witness the mating of sexes, mating of snakes. So he committed a crime, and as a result, he was turned into a woman. He not only saw the mating, he also disturbed that process by a stone. So he was turned into a woman, and he lived in that state for 7 years. Again, he saw the mating and then he was returned to his original form. That is, he became a man again. Another important story relates to Geus and Hera. Geus and Hera are quarreling over the question of love making and its enjoyment. Uh, they are of the divergent opinion, and one seems to say that female partner enjoys more, and another one points that it's male partner. Tiresias is summoned and he is asked to give a verdict, and he gives his opinion in favor of Geus. This enraged Hera, and she at once cursed Tiresias to be blind. But Geus was very kind enough to give him the power to see into future. So this Tiresias happens to be an enigmatic character, and he is full of symbolic significances. He is bisexual, he is an old man, and he is the one having wrinkled female breasts, and has had the privilege to enjoy a fuller experience of life than any mortal man or woman. Moreover, by the grace of Zeus, he is a seer who can clearly see the pages of human history and visualize the events of the past as well as the present. In that way, he turns out to be the fittest symbol of the human consciousness itself. The accumulated experience and knowledge of the race acquired during his long and devious passage through the immense stretch of time. He is the sensitive and enlightened mind of humanity, watching the depressing spectacle of the modern society fallen from the ancient height into the oblivion of the old values and sanctities. He is at once a relic of the past and a scion of the present, at once a prophet and a spectator of the agonizing drama in contemporary history, and a participator and fellow sufferer with a superior insight into the meaning of the ghostly masquerades that is called human life. Psychologically speaking, he can well be taken as the conscience of humanity, who is banished and disowned by the thoughtless men and women, but still strong enough to prick the barbs of their illusions, joys, hopes, and complacency. He is the voice of sensitive humanity, deploring the depiction of spirituality in the modern world and probing into the strange disease which it has mistaken with criminal nonchalance for health. Thus, Tiresias happens to be a fit symbol comprising all the complexities which is the hallmark of modern poetry. Dedication and epigraph. The poem is dedicated to Ezra Pound, for he made a jumble of bad passages into a poem. Eliot writes so. Ezra Pound was given the mammoth task of trimming and pruning, and he did it exceedingly well. That's why the poem is dedicated to Ezra Pound, where he declares Ezra Pound to be il miglior fabbro, the better craftsman. This phrase is taken from Dante's Purgatorio, Divine Comedy, in which the author pays tribute to Orant Daniel, a 12th century Italian poet. The epigraph is taken from Petronius' Satyricon, a Roman satirist who wrote in 1st century AD. And here he talks about one boy, Trimalchio, talking to his fellow friends, drunkards, about the women of Sibyl at Cumae. The woman, or in fact a woman, Sibyl at Cumae, is hanging in a case, and when asked, "What do you want?" in return she answers, "I want to die." The woman was a prophetess and had a boon of immortality from Apollo. The point is, she got the boon of immortality, immortality of life, not the immortality of youth, youngness. And she was granted this boon and was given a handful of sand. As long as the sand remains in her hand, she will be immortal. This is not only one story where we have seen some people, a man or a woman, asking immortality. We have Tithonus, on whom Tennyson wrote the poem Tithonus. There, Tithonus fell into love, rather, the goddess of dawn, fell into love with Tithonus, and Tithonus asked immortality. Again, he forgot to ask the immortality of life or immortality of youth, youngness. He became very old. He suffered a lot. And finally, he invokes his lady love. And his lady love, out of mercy, transforms Tithonus into a grasshopper. So, be it the women Sibyl at Cumae or Tithonus, or any common man of modern times or postmodern times, the point is not that one should have a big life in terms of longevity, in terms of length, but one should have a big life in terms of contentment, in terms of happiness. And the contentment and the happiness, not in terms of sensual pleasures, sexual pleasures, material pleasures, but in terms of spiritual awakenings, in terms of spiritual consciousness, in terms of the process to listen to the call of the soul, the desires of the soul to meet the oversoul, to devote oneself, to surrender oneself to the service of God. I think yes, so I have been talking about a brief introduction to the poem. It's quite possible that several things might have been left, but no issue at all. I shall come up with another video and we shall discuss the poem The Wasteland in details. Thank you.